Alright, so in this video, I'm going to be describing the technical specifications for each iPhone ever made, starting off with the iPhone 2G and going to the iPhone X, which is current day. So starting with the iPhone 2G, the iPhone 2G has a 3.5-inch display, has a 2-megapixel camera, 128 megabytes of RAM, only has an 8GB model, and about 700,000 sold in the first week, which isn't that much for today's standards. Going on to the iPhone 3G. The iPhone 3G has a 3.5-inch display, has a 2-megapixel camera, 128 megabytes of RAM, and has an 8 and 16 gigabyte model, and about 1 million sold in the first weekend. The iPhone 3GS has a 3.5-inch display, has a 3-megapixel camera, has 256 megabytes of RAM, and it has 3 different gigabyte models, which is 8, 16, and 32, and more than 1 million sold in the first 2 days. Going on to the iPhone 4, it has a 3.5-inch display, has a 5-megapixel camera, 512 megabytes of RAM, and has an 8, 16, and 32 gigabyte models, and about 1.7 sold in the second day. iPhone 4S, it has a 3.5-inch display, has an 8-megapixel camera, of 512 megabytes of RAM, 8, 16, 32, and 64 gigabyte models, and over 4 million sold in the first 3 days. The iPhone 5 has a 4-inch display, has an 8-megapixel camera, has 1 gigabyte of RAM, 16, 32, and 64 gigabyte models, and about 9 million sold in the first 3 days. On to the iPhone 5S. This also has a 4-inch display. It has an 8-megapixel camera with 1 gigabyte of RAM, and has 16, 32, and 64 gigabyte models, and about 9 million sold in the first week. iPhone 5C has a 4-inch display, has an 8-megapixel camera, a 1 gigabyte of RAM, 8, 16, and 32 gigabyte models, and about 9 million sold in the first 3 days. So moving on to the iPhone 6, this is where Apple really changed the design of their iPhones and where they first had the Plus model of the iPhone. So the iPhone 6 has a 4.7-inch display, has an 8-megapixel camera, 1 gigabyte of RAM, and has 16, 32, 64, and 128 gigabyte models, and about 10 million combined sales in the first week, including the iPhone 6 and the 6 Plus. The iPhone 6 Plus has a 5.5-inch display, an 8-megapixel camera, 6, 64, and 128 gigabyte models sold, and about 10 million combined sales, like I just said. Moving on to the iPhone 6, it has a 4.7-inch display, 6S. Has a 4.7-inch display, has a 12-megapixel camera, 2 gigabytes of RAM, 16, 32, 64, and 128 gigabyte models, and about 13 million combined sales in the first 3 days. The iPhone 6S Plus has a 5.5-inch display, has a 12-megapixel camera, 2 gigabytes of RAM, 16, 32, 64, and 128 gigabyte models, and about 32 million sold in the first 3 days. Moving on to the iPhone SE, this is where Apple took its design and made it a bit smaller for people with smaller hands. So the iPhone SE has a 4-inch display, has a 12-megapixel camera, has 2 gigabytes of RAM, 16, 32, 64, and 128 gigabyte models, and about 9 million sold in the first weekend. So now we're moving on to the iPhone 7. It has a 4.7-inch display, it has a 12-megapixel camera with 2 gigabytes of RAM, 32, 128, and 256 gigabyte models, and about 13 million combined sales in the first week. Onto the iPhone 7 Plus, has a 5.5-inch display, 12-megapixel camera, 3 gigabytes of RAM, and 32, 128, and 256 gigabyte models. And like I said, 13 million sales in the first week. The iPhone 8 has a 4.7-inch display and has a 12-megapixel camera with 2 gigabytes of RAM, and 64 and 256 gigabyte models, and about 32.2 million combined units sold in the first week. The iPhone 8 Plus has a 5.5-inch display, has a 12-megapixel camera with 3 gigabytes of RAM, 64 and 256 gigabyte models, and like I said, 32.2 combined units sold in the first week. And onto the iPhone X, which is our last device, has a 5.8-inch display. It has 12.2 megapixel camera, 3 gigabytes of RAM, 64 and 256 gigabyte models, and about 11.6 million sold in the first week.